Hi, everyone. My name is Josh. I am a co-founder at Pax, an organization dedicated to promote the peace of Jesus in the 21st century. This experience is a part of a Pax StoryArc called Cultural Identity. If you don't know what a story arc is and you're like, what does that mean? Feel free to poke around our website, maybe our About page to find out more. Right now, you are in the myth section of our story arc on cultural identity, and we're going to tackle some popular myths or lies that hold us back from embracing our God-given cultural identity. We have the amazing Kathy Khang, activist, author, speaker, consultant, and she's going to help us tackle some of these myths. Let's jump right in. Lie number one: as Christians, our cultural identities don't matter because we are all one in Christ.
So I heard that a lot. I still hear that a lot. And I hear it in reference to, we are neither Greek nor Jew, male nor female, kind of like, oh, yeah. But, the weird thing is at most churches, there's still a men's restroom and a women's restroom.
Yeah.
And somehow we've not said that identity doesn't matter because we're all one in Christ. So we're just going to have one big bathroom so that everybody gets to stand in line. And that somehow we have forgotten the beauty of God's diversity in creation. And that includes the differences in culture and in language and nature, which translates into food, right? So all of those things, to say that that doesn't matter, I think actually we're kind of giving God our middle finger and saying, you know what? If you really meant that we were all one in Christ, we should be all like vanilla or, a neutral shade of beige.
Yeah.
I don't know. Right. But that, I believe those differences and those distinctions are actually beautiful and they're important. Not all of those have to be ranked 1 or 2 or 3, but to say that there are differences. And I think we need to learn from those, especially when those differences kind of reflect back on how our culture here in the US is different than the global experience of Christianity.
Yeah. That's so good. I think, using the bathrooms as a basic example is really good. Talking about learning from and celebrating that diversity. Yeah. I mean, literally the second to last time I was at a church gathering on Sunday, we were talking about culture, and this guy literally said that right back to me as we were talking. And it's so ironic to me because in Galatians 2, so basically those verses in Galatians 3 are in the context of Paul rebuking Peter to his face because of a power differential within a church setting related to culture.
Right, right.
And that is the context of those verses. And so all one in Christ means something very different than, okay, we're just this flat vanilla whatever. But the question is, with that, who's defining what all is culturally? And the dominant people always get to define that.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that that goes right into that second lie, that second myth, that white is right, or that somehow the misunderstanding that white isn't a culture. Right.
Yeah.
And that somehow our understanding, particularly here in the US, is that being one in Christ means something very specific. It is socially, culturally bound.
Yeah.
And there is an understanding of what is right, right? So services should be in English, and services start on time and end at a certain time, right? Yeah. Those are all culturally bound, very Western culture, very US centric. And so that lie is that somehow when we say we're all one in Christ, isn't actually one in terms of our faith or our belief as Jesus followers, but that culturally our faith looks a certain way and is expressed a certain way.
Yeah. That's really good. I appreciate that. Yeah. So lie number two, white is right. That was such a good explanation of that. Is that something that you hear people actually stating outright, um, in social settings and Christian settings, or have you seen it just manifest in the ways that you talked about? And so people just learn to accept, like, well, I guess that's to follow Jesus, I have to do it like the dominant culture.
Yeah.
Is it overt
You know,
or
yeah, I
underneath?
don't really hear, thankfully, in churches, white is right, thankfully. However, it is all of the other social cues, right? Like if you look at, say, Sunday school material for the kids, and you look at the pictures of the kids and the children in your Sunday school material, VBS material, by and large, are the kids white?
Yeah.
Are they, blonde, blue eyed, fair skinned, able bodied, right? That is the way it's expressed. Or the
Mm.
images of Jesus and the 12 disciples. Like, strangely, they look like hipster pastors, all of them. It's very odd. And I think I found a lot of pushback when, even in music and church worship, songs that were being introduced in Spanish or in non-English languages, right?
Okay.
In what's considered foreign languages, people really pushing back. Like, why are we singing these hymns in another language when we're here in church in America? And I was like, English is not an official language. We don't have an official language here in the US, nor should the church have an official language. But that's very much kind of this unspoken understanding until somebody pushes back against that.
Yeah. That's really good. That's really good. Okay. So the third one, the third lie or myth that we struggle with as Christians and faith communities, you shouldn't play the culture card so much. Like, why are you talking about your culture so much? And this can become embedded within people.
Yeah. And, and it's also used, to talk about race, right? So it's that kind of overlay where race, culture, and ethnicity kind of come together and intersect. And it's interesting because somehow when I talk about my roots, I'm playing that card too much. Whereas everywhere else in the church, and even sometimes in the building itself, it is wrapped up in white identity, right? How you enter a room or how rooms are divided, or even when you enter into someone's home, there are cultural cues that say this is a Korean or Asian home. You take your shoes off. You do not wear your shoes into the home. And if you wear shoes, you have like inside shoes. I have a basket of slippers at my front door. And so I think what's hard is that pushback comes from people who don't necessarily see their cultural identity as being different. Their culture identity is the norm. And so it's always there. It's always typical or normal. And I think when that gets pushed up against, that's when those of us who push up against that are told, like, you shouldn't play that card too much. Whereas my pushback is, but you're always playing that card. Like, that's the only card you have.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think to say you shouldn't talk about culture so much, that is a cultural value coming out.
Right.
And it's almost always from whoever is within the dominant culture.
Yeah.
That's what's spoken to not upset the norm. Here's a question for like second and third generation, I guess, Korean Americans. Is this also true as a 19, 20, 21-year-old Korean American woman in a church setting or in a Christian setting that's Korean? Does that also apply to them as they're coming up and have a hybrid identity in the US? Do they also push up against that, not necessarily within the white dominant culture, but within Korean culture? Does that work the same?
Oh, I imagine it would be the same. I mean, I'm like 30 years out from being 20 years old, but I think I can still do the math. But even growing up in the Korean immigrant church,
Okay.
I felt that, right? I felt that I was being too American in the context of a Korean American church or a Korean immigrant church, that I didn't speak the language fluently enough anymore. And that my desire to assimilate and survive 6 days out of the week was pushing up against Korean norms, Korean immigrant norms. And so, that's going to continue for every generation. In broader culture, that's just kind of the generational gap that we talk about, right? But when it comes to immigrant communities, refugee communities, that's a lot harder to navigate because of the cost our families paid to be here in the U.S.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, thanks for that reflection. Number 4, which you've kind of touched on this a little bit, I don't see color or I don't see culture. Like, that's not something that I see where,
Right.
What about that one?
Well, and we hear it a lot. I think there is language, not only in the church, right, but like within the world, within the U.S., specifically around conversations around race.
Okay.
And to say, I'm colorblind. And the belief that saying that you're colorblind actually means that you're anti-racist. And it's not the same thing. And I like to tell people, why would you not want to see color in your everyday life, right? In your everyday life, if you are actually colorblind, that's considered a disability. You want to be able to distinguish red from green. You want to be able to see the different shades of yellow. You want to be able to see that that green is different from that green. And that doesn't mean one is better than the other. It means that again, it points to the diversity and the beauty of how God creates and created.
Yeah.
To see the appreciation in all of that. And then to know, for me as a Korean American woman, I actually want you to notice that the way my rice tastes and feels, the texture of it and how it's cooked and how it even smells is going to be different than the rice that my white friends grew up making, buying in a 1-pound bag. Like, I can't even imagine, why would you bother buying 1 pound of rice? I buy rice 25 pounds at a time, right? So even that, to say, like, I don't see those distinctions would be like, well, then you are going to mess up your rice.
Yeah.
You're going to mess up the way something was intended to be appreciated, to be experienced, right?
That's really
It
good.
always goes back to food.
You're like, all my analogies connect to food and
I know.
yoga. Food
Wait.
and yoga. No, that's good. That's awesome. I'm going to reflect on that a bunch after this. I'll take it from a little bit of a different angle. I don't see color. You took it from the cultural side, which is so important to celebrate the the richness of color. And I love how you related that to seeing colors and relating that to culture. This lie's repeated a lot for sure amongst white folks like me, but I've heard it also like walking with and being in friendship with a lot of people of color as they've been trained, like, well, because race is a social construct and it's a bad one, then I'm not going to see it. But that's dangerous because it has been constructed. It does exist. It's not going away. And so it's like saying there's a virus we all suffer from. Some of us suffer from it far more than most, both individually and systemically. But then a large segment of the population is going to act like we don't have a virus. Yeah. Kind of like 2020. Interesting.
Wow. Josh, I'm going to have to think about that.
I didn't mean for that to connect. But that's the problem with saying I refuse to acknowledge race or racialization.
Right. Because it exists.
It's there.
It's there every day. It's there, right? It's the color of the Band-Aid that you can buy at the store, and it's supposed to be flesh, right? Or for women, way back when we used to wear pantyhose, you pick up the color nude. Well, whose nude is that, right? What does that mean? And even Crayola crayons, as the school year has started, and that idea of like flesh colored crayons. Well, there used to be like one color, and Crayola eventually came out with this whole rainbow of flesh colored crayons.
Yeah.
In reality, right, is that there is this construct. We live in that construct. To say it doesn't exist doesn't make it go away, and it doesn't undo all of the things that have been created to sustain that.
That's so good.
Yeah.
That's so good. I'll leave it at that because that was amazing. So number 5, we've got a few more. And this one is the saddest as I'm reading through these. So myth number 5, I need to hide my cultural identity to fit in.
Yeah, we call it assimilation, right? And I think there's a lot of angst over this, and I'm still working through that, right? My name is Kathy Khang, but it's actually not. My name is Kang Kyung-ah. My parents gave me an American name so that when I entered school, I could fit in, so that there wouldn't be a pause from the teacher and this awkward butchering of my name, even though my last name was always butchered. And so there is definitely this message to hide cultural identity and cultural differences for assimilation, which sounds like we want to fit in, but it's also survival.
Okay.
Right. And so I think some of the choices that we make are so that we don't have to fight all of the little battles, and we're going to choose some other battles to fight. Somebody asked me if I wanted to reclaim my Korean name, and I've thought about that. And I think at this point in my life, that is not the battle I want to fight.
Okay.
And so people will ask me, and I'll try to teach them my Korean name. But at the end of the day, that's not going to be the thing where I, hang my hat on.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I can't speak to this one as a white dude, right? From a dominant culture. And so it's really good to hear you process it and the way that you think about it, assimilation, survival. And as a follower of Jesus, I just think of Jesus in the first century, being a Jewish man, embracing his Jewishness, a part of a people who have been forced through subjugation and exile to assimilate. And what does that look like? And so, there's so many beautiful lessons in that. It ties into the last one. This is the bonus one, number 6. My culture doesn't matter. And no matter, let's say it's something really small or something really big, what would you say to somebody who's struggling with that as a follower of Jesus? My culture it doesn't matter.
I would say it isn't necessarily the most important thing or the thing that has to be primary in your life, but your culture is one of the ways in which you look at faith and how you live out faith, right? We talk about social location and recognizing, are you rural, urban, suburban? You look through and live your life out through that lens. Your culture is one of those lenses. And I think it does matter. I think it is hard because for many of us, through assimilation, we're trying to figure out what that really means. Right? How do we reclaim something or be able to name it when we've been told, really by the majority culture, by white America, that our differences are not important or stupid, or even worse, goes against God and unbiblical, without really understanding where those cultural traditions come from, how they can teach us more about who God is. So I say to people, non-white people and white people who have lost touch with their cultural ties, culture does matter. It's shaped you and your family's journey. And even for our churches have a cultural identity, whether or not we choose to name it. And when we name it, it doesn't have power over us, right? We can change it, we can adjust it, we can celebrate it, we can share it, we can communicate it. But if we try to pretend it's not there, it's just going to continue to perpetuate.
Two personal questions as we're winding down. What myths have you personally struggled with as a follower of Jesus throughout the years? What's been some of your battles?
I'll talk about one of my more recent battles that I'm really wrestling with as I've been going through a deconstruction and reconstruction of my faith, in being able to name places in which my theology has been really colonized, and how that impacted the way I saw my family's immigration story. And it's tied to that understanding of assimilation, and kind of pointing fingers at my parents' generation of like, you bought into the white supremacist lie of the American dream. How could you do that? You know, and really wrestling with, where do I see grace? And where do I see survival?
Yeah.
Where do I see a belief and faith that God has something more for them that isn't just tied to a capitalistic dream of bigger buildings, bigger houses, fancier things? Because I think that conversation around assimilation can often be stuck in that place of saying, yeah, you know, the older generation, they just care about money. And, you know, I'm getting older and I am worried about money. I'm worried about how we're going to pay off the student or the parent debt for 3 kids in college.
Yeah.
But I also think about the reality that I would have been living had my family stayed in Korea.
Yeah.
And the misogyny I would be experiencing there versus the misogyny I experience here.
Right.
It's not great here, but I will say it's not what I would have experienced there. And that's not to paint America as this amazing, you know, city on the hill, but that my parents had an imagination for something that I can't fully appreciate. And so I'm still really wrestling with that myth of the American dream and where that plays into a prophetic imagination that my parents really did have for a future that I can't imagine, because I feel like my kids have it pretty good, despite the 2020 dumpster fire that it is.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that answer, as it is a personal question. The second part of that is what have been, or what is a breakthrough for you as you've struggled with different myths? Maybe it's that one, maybe it's a different one, but as young people of color are listening to this, what is an encouragement with a breakthrough you've had in overcoming some of these myths?
Ooh, that one is hard. One of the myths is tied to, it's all tied loosely, 1 through 6, is the not being enough of one or the other.
Okay.
Right? That I'm not Korean enough, or that I'm not American enough. And I think that I'm at that place where I'm really okay with not ever being fully one or the other. And that there is something about an absolute or absolutism that for me was tied to my theology, that somehow as Christians, I knew absolutely it was yes or no.
Wow.
And I feel like right now, my understanding of culture and understanding of what it means to be Korean American Jesus follower is it is yes and both and maybe could be and I don't know. And that breakthrough moment has been every time I have to check off a box.
Okay.
Right. And in the 50 years, there has been a lot of box checking and realizing that even in the construct of the church in the US, we still have a box of what it means to be a Christian here in America.
Yeah.
We check those boxes off, whether or not we're filling out like a visitor card, you know, and every time feeling like, did I check the right boxes? Right. And realizing, you know what? Somebody made this survey up. This is not going to help me be a better neighbor. This is not going to help me be the good news in my neighborhood and in my family. And so every time I have boxes to check is that kind of like chipping away. Aha, aha, aha.
So I don't know about you, but Kathy has so much to teach me about cultural identity. I loved holding that interview and interacting with her. Listen, I hope that you would begin to dismantle, take apart these myths and these lies that we can commonly believe as Christians. And it's our prayer at Pax that you would learn to resist these lies and embrace the truth that God has given you a beautiful cultural identity that reflects God's image in the world. Continue with us on this journey by scrolling down to look at some more of the content that we have in the myth section. And we have 2 more path points that are forthcoming. Definitely be on the lookout for those as we publish more content through our website, madeforpax.org.